Picture a palace shimmering on a narrow strip of Florida coastline, its Spanish tiles glowing in the subtropical sun, its perfectly manicured lawns rolling from ocean to lake, its 126 rooms stuffed with treasures looted from European ruins, and ask yourself this question: what does a house like this cost, and who really paid the price? Mar-a-Lago, which translates from Spanish as sea to lake, stands today as one of America's most recognizable and controversial private estates, a place where presidents have dined, where classified documents have allegedly been mishandled, where foreign diplomats have mingled with club members over shrimp cocktail and political intrigue, where the machinery of power operates behind a facade of gilded opulence. But this glittering mansion harbors secrets far darker than anything found in its recent headlines, secrets about the true nature of American wealth, the invisible hands that built our monuments to excess, the fragile illusions of permanence that money creates, and the brutal truth that no amount of gold can purchase safety, acceptance, or redemption. What would these walls confess if they could speak? What stories lie buried beneath the imported Italian marble, the hand-carved Portuguese stone, the 15,000 Spanish tiles shipped across an ocean to construct an American fever dream during the Roaring Twenties? This is not simply the story of a mansion, it is a chronicle of American ambition in its most grandiose and grotesque forms, a tale of how great fortunes are made and what they destroy in their making, a meditation on the relationship between beauty and exploitation, between visibility and vulnerability, and ultimately, a dark mirror held up to our endless, exhausting obsession with old money and the cruel myths it perpetuates. The story begins not with Donald Trump, whose name has become synonymous with Mar-a-Lago in our contemporary moment, but with a woman born into unimaginable privilege in 1887 Springfield, Illinois, Marjorie Merriweather Post, the only child of Charles William Post, a man who transformed American breakfast tables and built an empire from cereal. C.W. Post was not born wealthy, he was born desperate, a sickly, neurasthenic entrepreneur who suffered nervous breakdowns and sought cures at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, where he studied the health food movement and emerged with a vision. He would sell Americans on the virtues of Postum, a coffee substitute made from roasted grains, and then grape nuts, and then Post Toasties. Each product marketed with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that American consumers would pay handsomely for the promise of health, vitality, and modern convenience. By the time Marjorie was a young woman, the Postum cereal company had made her father spectacularly wealthy, but wealth could not save him from the demons of mental illness, and in 1914, at age 59, C.W. Post took his own life, leaving 27-year-old Marjorie with a fortune estimated at $20 million, equivalent to more than $250 million today, and control of a rapidly expanding food empire. Overnight, she became the wealthiest woman in America, thrust into a role few women of her era were permitted to occupy, that of a business titan, a corporate director, a captain of industry. But Marjorie Post was not content merely to inherit wealth, she would expand it, transform the Postum cereal company into General Foods Corporation through aggressive acquisitions of brands like Jell-O, Maxwell House Coffee, Sanka, and Bird's Eye Frozen Foods, becoming one of the first women to sit on the board of a major American corporation and proving that she possessed not just her father's money but his relentless business acumen. Yet for all her professional success, for all her demonstrated competence in the boardroom, Marjorie Post remained trapped in the social expectations of her gender and class. She was a woman whose identity would be defined, in the society pages and in her own restless heart, by her marriages, her homes, her parties, her collections, her performance of wealth. In 1920, Marjorie married her second husband, Edward Francis Hutton, the stockbroker and co-founder of E.F. Hutton & Company, and together they embarked on the project that would define her legacy, the construction of a winter retreat in Palm Beach, Florida, a place where the weather was always warm, where the northern elite came to escape the cold and to see and be seen, where social hierarchies were ruthlessly enforced and where acceptance into the inner circles required not just money but taste, breeding, connections, and the indefinable quality known as class. Palm Beach in the 1920s was in the midst of a spectacular land boom, a frenzy of speculation and development that would collapse in 1926 but before its fall produced some of the most extravagant private estates America had ever seen. Post and Hutton were already members of Palm Beach society, they owned a modest mansion called the Biltmore, but for Marjorie, modest was no longer sufficient. She wanted something unprecedented, something that would announce to the world that she belonged at the very pinnacle of American aristocracy, something that would serve as both fortress and stage, both private sanctuary and public performance space. In 1923, she purchased a 17-acre plot of land, a narrow barrier island with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and Lake Worth on the other, and commissioned architect Marion Sims Wyeth to design what she described as a memorial to her father, though in truth it would be a memorial to her own ambition, her own vision of what wealth could purchase and what it could proclaim. For interior design and exterior decorations, she hired Joseph Urban, the legendary Viennese designer who had revolutionized the look of the Ziegfeld Follies and who would bring to Mar-a-Lago an eclectic aesthetic blending Spanish, Venetian, Moorish, and Portuguese influences into what can only be described as architectural fantasy, not a faithful reproduction of any single European style but rather an American capitalist's version of what European grandeur should look like, a pastiche, a performance, a stage set. The construction of Mar-a-Lago between 1924 and 1927 consumed approximately $7 million, equivalent to $127 million today, and required the labor of 600 workers toiling in the Florida heat, including 300 skilled European artisans imported specifically for the project because American craftsmen were deemed insufficiently trained in the techniques required. These workers installed 36,000 Spanish tiles from the 15th century, some bearing Moorish designs, carefully removed from European buildings and shipped across the Atlantic. They quarried Dorian stone from Italy, they carved Portuguese architectural details, they hand-painted ceilings in the Venetian style, they constructed intricate stonework, elaborate balconies, a 75-foot tower, an outdoor patio with a view of the ocean, a breakfast room, a dining room that could seat more than 40 guests, a ballroom, a marble entrance hall, and 126 rooms sprawling across 62,500 square feet of unparalleled excess. The estate featured cutting-edge technology for its time, an underground tunnel connecting the main house to the beach pavilion so that guests could reach the ocean without being exposed to the sun, a state-of-the-art electrical system, elaborate climate control, and a system of bells and call boxes that allowed the owner to summon servants from anywhere in the house. And who were these servants? They were the invisible hands, the staff of dozens, maids, cooks, butlers, chauffeurs, groundskeepers, laundresses, mostly working-class immigrants, black Americans, and poor whites who maintained the machinery of luxury, who prepared the five-course dinners, who pressed the silk gowns, who polished the silver, who manicured the lawns, who scrubbed the floors, who ensured that every surface gleamed, who made the fantasy possible and who were expected to remain unseen, unheard, their labor erased from the official story of Mar-a-Lago. The house was never meant for them, it was meant for the elite, for visiting royalty, for industrialists and financiers, for political figures and socialites, for the people Marjorie Post believed were her peers and who she hoped would accept her as one of their own. But acceptance, she would learn, is not something wealth can guarantee. Mar-a-Lago officially opened in January 1927, and for the next 4 decades, Marjorie Post reigned over it as one of America's most celebrated hostesses, throwing legendary parties that mixed business with pleasure, politics with pageantry. She entertained the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the Prince of Wales who would become King Edward VIII, ambassadors, senators, generals, movie stars, business tycoons, anyone who mattered in mid-century American society. But underneath the glittering surface, underneath the performance of effortless grace and inherited nobility, Marjorie Post was engaged in something more urgent and more exhausting. She was fighting for legitimacy, fighting to prove that serial money was just as good as railroad money or oil money or banking money, fighting to establish herself as not merely wealthy but cultured, not merely rich but refined. This insecurity would drive her to become one of the most prolific art collectors of her generation, amassing treasures from around the world with a particular obsession with Russian imperial art, an obsession that intensified during her third marriage to Joseph E. Davies, a Washington lawyer whom she married in 1935 and who was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1937. Post accompanied her husband to Moscow, where she witnessed the Stalinist purges firsthand, where she watched the Soviet regime liquidate the remnants of the old aristocracy, where she saw Russian imperial treasures, Faberge eggs, jeweled icons, porcelain, paintings, furniture, being sold off for hard currency to fund Stalin's industrial ambitions. And Marjorie Post, with her American dollars and her insatiable appetite for acquisition, bought voraciously, purchasing objects that had once belonged to the Romanov dynasty, purchasing pieces of a dead empire, purchasing the material remnants of a world that had been violently destroyed. What did she see in these objects? What did she feel when she held a Fabergé egg that had once graced the private chambers of a Russian empress? Was it simply the collector's thrill of ownership, or was it something darker, a recognition that all great wealth is built on the ruins of something else, that every treasure has a story of dispossession, that beauty and brutality are not opposites but intimates? By the time she returned to the United States in 1938, as war clouds gathered over Europe and the world slid toward another catastrophic conflict, Marjorie Post had transformed Hillwood, her Washington, D.C. estate, into a museum-quality showcase for her Russian collection, but Mar-a-Lago remained her winter palace, her place of escape, her fantasy of permanence in an increasingly unstable world. Her marriage to Davies would crumble in the 1950s, he became ill-tempered and difficult, and she, who could not tolerate anything less than perfection, divorced him in 1955. She would marry once more, to Pittsburgh industrialist Herbert May in 1958, and divorce once more in 1964, and through it all, through 4 marriages and 3 divorces, through the rise and fall of her business empire as General Foods expanded and eventually moved beyond her direct control, through the deaths of friends and family, through the social upheavals of the 1960s and early 1970s, Mar-a-Lago remained her constant, her fortress, her statement of defiance against time and change. But maintaining Mar-a-Lago consumed a fortune, $1 million per year in operating costs by the early 1970s, equivalent to more than $6 million today, a sum that required an army of servants, constant repairs, endless upkeep, and the kind of resources that even a woman of Marjorie Post's wealth could not sustain forever. In 1973, as she lay dying at her Hillwood estate in Washington at age 86, she made a decision that reveals both her idealism and her profound misunderstanding of American political priorities. She bequeathed Mar-a-Lago to the United States government, intending it to be used as a winter White House for presidents and foreign dignitaries, a place where the nation's leaders could conduct diplomacy in a setting of beauty and grandeur. It was a vision born of patriotism and perhaps of vanity, a desire to see her creation serve a purpose greater than private pleasure, but it was also a fantasy that ignored the brutal realities of government budgets, bureaucratic priorities, and the simple fact that accepting such a gift meant accepting responsibility for its astronomical upkeep. The National Park Service, reluctant from the beginning, officially accepted Mar-a-Lago in 1980 after Post's daughters had spent 7 years trying to maintain it and failing, but the federal government quickly realized what the Post family already knew: the estate was a financial albatross, a money pit that consumed resources without providing any clear public benefit, especially given its location directly beneath the flight path of Palm Beach International Airport, which made it unsuitable for high-level diplomatic meetings requiring security and privacy. The maintenance costs alone exceeded what the government was willing to pay, and by 1981, just 1 year after officially accepting the property, the National Park Service returned Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation, essentially admitting that the gift was too expensive to keep. And so the mansion sat, empty and slowly deteriorating, a white elephant on the Palm Beach coastline, too grand to be easily sold, too expensive to be easily maintained, too specific in its opulence to appeal to most buyers who might be able to afford it. The Post Foundation struggled to find a buyer throughout the early 1980s, at one point considering subdividing the estate and selling off parcels of the land, a plan that horrified local preservationists who feared the destruction of one of Palm Beach's most significant architectural landmarks. And then, in 1985, a buyer emerged, Donald J. Trump, the brash young real estate developer from New York who was at the height of his 1980s success, whose name was becoming synonymous with ostentatious luxury, who had just completed Trump Tower in Manhattan and who was looking for a trophy property in Florida, a place where he could establish himself as a player not just in New York but on the national stage. Trump's acquisition of Mar-a-Lago is a story that reveals as much about American capitalism and the construction of wealth as anything in the mansion's prior history. He purchased the estate for a mere $7 to $10 million depending on which source you believe, a fraction of its appraised value and a tiny percentage of what it had cost to build, by employing a strategy that was equal parts shrewd negotiation and ruthless manipulation. He allegedly threatened to build high-rise condominiums on adjacent land he controlled, structures that would have blocked the ocean views from Mar-a-Lago and destroyed much of its value, thereby pressuring the Post Foundation to accept his lowball offer. He purchased the furniture and furnishings separately for an additional $3 million, and suddenly, for less than $15 million total, Donald Trump owned one of America's most spectacular private estates, a property that would become central to his carefully constructed image as a billionaire of impeccable taste, though in reality his taste ran more toward gold-plated excess and gaudy opulence than the refined European aesthetic Marjorie Post had cultivated. For nearly a decade, Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a private residence, but the costs of maintaining the property were staggering even for him. And he faced the same problem the Post Foundation had faced: how do you monetize a mansion that costs a fortune to operate? His solution, proposed in the mid-1990s, reveals the transactional logic that governs all his endeavors. He would convert Mar-a-Lago into a private club, charging wealthy members initiation fees and annual dues, effectively turning Marjorie Post's dream home into a profit-generating business. But there was a problem: Palm Beach was not ready to accept Donald Trump or his vision for Mar-a-Lago. The town's old guard establishment, the families who had dominated Palm Beach society for generations, the people who belonged to the ultra-exclusive clubs like the Everglades Club and the Bath and Tennis Club, viewed Trump as an outsider, a parvenu, a brash New Yorker whose gold-plated aesthetic and tabloid lifestyle offended their sense of decorum, and they opposed his plans to convert the estate into a club, citing concerns about traffic, noise, and the general commercialization of a historic property. What happened next has become a central part of Trump's own mythology about himself, a story he has told repeatedly to deflect accusations of racism and to position himself as a champion of equality. He filed a lawsuit in 1995 against the town of Palm Beach, alleging discrimination and claiming that the town's opposition to his club was motivated by anti-Semitism and racism because, unlike the other exclusive Palm Beach clubs which restricted membership to white Christians, Mar-a-Lago would be open to Jews, African Americans, and other minorities. Trump's lawyers sent members of the town council copies of classic films about discrimination, Gentleman's Agreement, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a theatrical gesture meant to shame the town into backing down. Whether Trump's motivations were genuinely progressive or simply strategic, a way to outmaneuver his opponents and gain approval for his club, remains a matter of debate, but the result was that in 1995, Mar-a-Lago officially became a private club with membership initially priced at $100,000 as an initiation fee plus $14,000 in annual dues, numbers that would eventually climb to $500,000 and $200,000 respectively as Mar-a-Lago became not just a club but a symbol, a brand, a place where proximity to power could be purchased for the right price. And here we arrive at one of the central paradoxes of Mar-a-Lago's story. Trump used accusations of discrimination against Palm Beach's old elite to open his club to a more diverse membership than the traditional WASP establishments, and yet his own business empire has been repeatedly accused of discriminatory practices. From the Justice Department lawsuit in 1973 alleging that Trump properties refused to rent to black tenants, to accusations from former employees about discriminatory treatment, to his inflammatory rhetoric during his political career. Mar-a-Lago's policy of accepting Jewish and black members was certainly more progressive than the exclusionary policies of clubs like the Everglades, but progressiveness is relative, and a club with a $500,000 initiation fee is hardly egalitarian. It simply replaces one form of exclusion with another, substituting wealth for bloodline, money for pedigree, but exclusion nonetheless. The club proved successful, attracting a mix of wealthy retirees, business executives, social climbers, and eventually, as Trump's political career ascended, Republican donors and political operatives who understood that membership at Mar-a-Lago meant access to the man who would become president. But success brought its own problems, its own scandals, its own uncomfortable revelations about who actually does the work that makes luxury possible. Investigative reporting by outlets like The New Yorker revealed that Mar-a-Lago, like many luxury resorts, relied heavily on temporary foreign workers recruited through H-2B visa programs, primarily from Haiti and Romania, to fill positions as cooks, housekeepers, servers, and other service staff. In other words, the very same jobs that American workers might have filled were being given to foreign workers who could be paid less and who had fewer legal protections, and this was happening while Trump built his presidential campaign on promises to reduce immigration and prioritize American workers. A hypocrisy so blatant that it would have destroyed a conventional politician but which Trump's supporters either ignored or explained away. More damning still were reports that the Trump Organization at Mar-a-Lago and other Trump properties had knowingly employed undocumented workers for years, only firing them when their status became public, which raised the obvious question: if Trump was willing to exploit undocumented labor when it benefited his bottom line, what did his anti-immigration rhetoric actually mean? Was it policy or performance? Conviction or calculation? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that for Trump, as for many wealthy Americans throughout history, labor is simply a resource to be exploited as cheaply as possible, and the political rhetoric about American workers and immigration is disconnected from the actual business practices that generate profit. The invisible hands that serve champagne, that prepare gourmet meals, that clean the guest rooms, that maintain the grounds, are almost exclusively people of color, many of them immigrants, many of them earning wages that would be considered poverty level outside the inflated economy of Palm Beach, and their stories, their struggles, their lives, remain as invisible today as they were in Marjorie Post's time, erased from the official narrative of Mar-a-Lago as a place of glamour and power. But if Mar-a-Lago's labor practices reveal the hidden exploitation that underlies luxury, its transformation into the so-called Winter White House during Trump's presidency revealed something even more troubling: the collapse of boundaries between public service and private profit, between national security and personal enrichment, between the responsibilities of the presidency and the prerogatives of a business owner. From the moment Trump took office in January 2017, Mar-a-Lago became a stage for governing, a place where the president conducted meetings with foreign leaders, where he and his national security team reviewed classified intelligence in the middle of the dining room within earshot of club members, where he made consequential decisions about military strikes and diplomatic policy while surrounded by wealthy donors who had paid for the privilege of proximity. The image of Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe reviewing intelligence reports about a North Korean missile test while sitting at a table in Mar-a-Lago's outdoor dining area, with club members taking cell phone photos and posting them on social media, became an instant symbol of the administration's casual disregard for security protocols. But it was more than just bad optics. It was a fundamental violation of the principle that public office should be used to serve the public interest, not to generate revenue for the officeholders' private businesses. Every weekend Trump spent at Mar-a-Lago meant that the club could market itself as the place where history was being made, where members could rub shoulders with cabinet secretaries and foreign dignitaries, where a wealthy businessman might have the chance to whisper a suggestion into the president's ear over dinner, and the value of Mar-a-Lago membership skyrocketed as a result. Membership fees doubled from $100,000 to $200,000 just after Trump's election, and suddenly Mar-a-Lago was not just a club but a vehicle for what ethics experts call soft corruption, a way for individuals and corporations to gain access to power not through official channels but through the purchase of proximity, through the investment in a relationship that might yield dividends in the form of favorable policies, government contracts, regulatory relief, or simply the prestige of being seen as someone who matters. Foreign governments understood this calculation perfectly well, which is why at least 150 foreign government officials visited Trump properties during his presidency according to tracking by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, often staying at Trump hotels or visiting Mar-a-Lago when they could have met the president at the White House or other official venues. They understood that spending money at Trump properties was a form of flattery, a signal of respect, a way of currying favor with a president whose business interests had not been divested or placed in a true blind trust despite promises to the contrary. And the security risks of conducting sensitive government business at a private club accessible to anyone with sufficient wealth were not merely theoretical. In 2019, a Chinese woman named Yujing Zhang was arrested at Mar-a-Lago carrying 2 Chinese passports, 4 cell phones, a laptop, an external hard drive, and a thumb drive that allegedly contained malware, raising immediate concerns about whether she was an intelligence operative attempting to spy on the president and his conversations with other world leaders. Zhang had gained entry to the club by telling security guards she was there to use the pool, a lie that was somehow sufficient to get her past the front desk and into the secure area of the estate, a security breach so staggering that it prompted congressional Democrats to call for an FBI investigation into Mar-a-Lago's security vulnerabilities. Zhang was eventually convicted of trespassing and lying to federal agents and sentenced to 8 months in prison before being deported, but the incident revealed what intelligence experts had been warning about for years. Mar-a-Lago was a counterintelligence nightmare, a soft target where foreign spies could potentially gain access simply by paying the membership fee or by exploiting the casual, country club atmosphere that encouraged members to bring guests and where background checks were minimal and security was oriented more toward keeping out paparazzi than trained intelligence operatives. These concerns about security and conflicts of interest, troubling as they were, would pale in comparison to the scandal that erupted in August 2022 when FBI agents executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago and discovered more than 300 classified documents, including materials marked top secret and sensitive compartmented information, stored in various locations around the estate, in Trump's office, in a storage room, even in a bathroom, according to photographs released by federal prosecutors. The discovery of these documents, which Trump had allegedly refused to return despite repeated requests from the National Archives and Records Administration and despite a subpoena demanding their return, triggered a criminal investigation that would result in a federal indictment charging Trump with willful retention of national defense information, obstruction of justice, and making false statements, among other crimes. The details that emerged from court filings painted a picture of stunning recklessness: classified documents containing intelligence about nuclear capabilities, defense systems, foreign governments, and covert operations, materials so sensitive that their unauthorized disclosure could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security, stored in a private club where thousands of members and guests had access, where foreign nationals visited regularly, where security was demonstrably inadequate, where the barriers between public and private had been completely erased. Prosecutors alleged that Trump had personally directed efforts to move boxes of documents to hide them from investigators, that his lawyers had signed false statements attesting that all classified materials had been returned when in fact hundreds remained, and that he had shown classified documents to visitors at Mar-a-Lago without authorization and without regard for whether those visitors had security clearances. In short, that he had treated the nation's most sensitive secrets as personal property, as trophies, as souvenirs of his presidency that he was entitled to keep in the same way one might keep old photographs or campaign memorabilia, displaying a level of narcissism and disregard for consequences that is almost incomprehensible. And yet, what is perhaps most revealing about the classified documents scandal is not Trump's alleged crimes but the way Mar-a-Lago itself enabled them. The estate's very nature as a hybrid space, simultaneously private residence and commercial business and political headquarters, created ambiguities that Trump exploited, blurring the lines between personal property and government property, between private space and public function, between business interest and national interest. Mar-a-Lago had become a physical manifestation of Trump's philosophy of power, that rules are for other people, that wealth and status confer the right to operate outside normal constraints, that accountability is something to be evaded rather than embraced, that the machinery of government exists to serve the interests of the president rather than the other way around. In this sense, Mar-a-Lago is not an aberration in American history but rather an apotheosis, a culmination of trends that have been building for decades: the increasing fusion of wealth and political power, the erosion of boundaries between public service and private enrichment, the transformation of government into a vehicle for elite self-dealing, the collapse of norms and institutions that once constrained the behavior of those at the top of the hierarchy. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago as a symbol of arrived wealth, of acceptance into an American aristocracy that she believed existed and that she desperately wanted to join, but what she created, inadvertently, was a monument to something darker, a testament to the truth that in America, enough money can insulate you from almost anything, from labor laws, from security requirements, from ethical constraints, from legal accountability, perhaps even from reality itself. But even monuments to wealth are not permanent, and even the most carefully constructed illusions eventually crack. The environmental realities confronting Mar-a-Lago are stark and unavoidable. The estate sits directly on a coastline that is projected to experience between 1 and 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century, possibly more if ice sheet collapse accelerates, which means that the very ground on which Mar-a-Lago stands may be underwater or uninhabitable within the lifetimes of people alive today. The coral reefs that once protected Florida's coastline from storm surge and wave action are dying at catastrophic rates due to ocean warming and acidification, reefs that Post and Hutton would have sailed past in the 1920s, reefs that sheltered the fish and sea creatures that swam in the waters around the estate, reefs that are now bleaching and crumbling, leaving the shoreline vulnerable to hurricanes that are growing more intense as the climate changes. Palm Beach County, where Mar-a-Lago sits, already experiences king tides that flood streets and send seawater bubbling up through storm drains, a preview of the chronic inundation that is coming, and yet the response from the property's owner and the political coalition he represents has been to deny the science, to cut funding for climate adaptation, to prioritize short-term profit over long-term survival, as if pretending the water isn't rising will somehow keep it at bay. There is a cruel irony in this, that Mar-a-Lago, built as a fantasy of permanence, as a statement that wealth could purchase eternity, may end up as proof of the opposite, as evidence that no amount of money can protect you from the consequences of collective choices, from the externalities that capitalism encourages us to ignore, from the reality that we all share one planet and one atmosphere and one interconnected system that does not care about property lines or membership fees or how much you paid for your mansion. So what, in the end, is the true story of Mar-a-Lago? What does this mansion, this controversial estate, this stage for American power and ambition, actually tell us about who we are and what we value? The narrative that has dominated public discourse tends to focus on Trump, his acquisition of the property, his conversion of it into a club, his use of it as a winter White House, his alleged mishandling of classified documents, and certainly those elements are significant, but they are also just the most recent chapter in a much longer and more complex story. A story that begins with the exploitation of labor to extract wealth from American consumers through the transformation of grain into breakfast cereals, that continues with the construction of an architectural fantasy on the backs of 600 workers whose names we do not know and whose stories have been erased, that encompasses the desperate social climbing of a woman who had everything except the one thing she wanted most, unqualified acceptance by an elite that would always view her as an outsider despite her fortune. That includes the calculated performance of openness and diversity as a strategy to overcome opposition from an old guard establishment, that reveals the systematic exploitation of immigrant labor to maintain luxury while simultaneously demonizing immigrants in political rhetoric, that demonstrates the collapse of boundaries between public service and private profit and the emergence of soft corruption as a dominant mode of governance. And that ultimately holds up a mirror to American society and forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between wealth and power, between labor and luxury, between the visible and the invisible, between the myths we tell ourselves and the truths we prefer not to acknowledge. Mar-a-Lago is not unique, it is representative, a template, an example of patterns that repeat throughout American history and throughout the architecture of wealth in every society. The invisible servants who made Post's parties possible are not different in kind from the undocumented housekeepers and temporary foreign workers who make Trump's club possible. The difference is only that we now have investigative journalists who can make the invisible visible, who can document the hypocrisy, who can connect the rhetoric to the reality. The security breaches and intelligence failures at Mar-a-Lago are not aberrations but predictable consequences of a system that allows wealth to purchase exemptions from normal rules and accountability, that treats the wealthy as inherently trustworthy and deserving of the benefit of the doubt even when they have repeatedly demonstrated the opposite. The environmental threats facing the estate are not unique to Mar-a-Lago but are being experienced by coastal properties around the world, by poor communities who lack the resources to adapt, by island nations that will disappear entirely beneath the rising seas, and yet the response from those with the most resources and the greatest responsibility has been denial, delay, and the prioritization of short-term profit over long-term survival. The classified documents discovered at Mar-a-Lago represent not just one man's recklessness but a broader truth about how power operates in America, that those at the top believe, often correctly, that they can break rules with impunity, that accountability is for other people, that wealth and status confer a kind of immunity, and that the institutions meant to enforce the law will hesitate, will negotiate, will handle the powerful with kid gloves even as they treat the powerless with maximum severity. And so we return to the question posed at the beginning: what would these walls confess if they could speak? Perhaps they would tell us that beauty and exploitation are not opposites but partners, that every glittering surface is maintained by Invisible hands, that the grandeur we admire rests on foundations we prefer not to examine. Perhaps they would tell us that wealth does not guarantee security or acceptance or happiness, that Marjorie Post spent a lifetime trying to purchase belonging and died without ever fully achieving it, that her carefully curated collections and her legendary parties and her architectural masterpiece could not fill the emptiness at the center of her life or protect her from the loneliness of being seen as a checkbook rather than a person. Perhaps they would tell us that houses are not just buildings but stories, not just physical structures but embodiments of the values and assumptions and contradictions of the people who built them and the societies that produced them. Perhaps they would tell us that no monument to wealth is permanent, that all empires fall, that the sea does not care how much you spent on imported Spanish tiles, that time erases everything, and that the only legacy that endures is the one written in how we treated other people, in whether we used our resources to help or to harm, in whether we chose solidarity or selfishness, in whether we recognized our common humanity or insisted on our exceptional right to take more than our share. Mar-a-Lago stands today as one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in America, appraised at values ranging from $18 million according to some estimates to several $100 million according to others, depending on whether you value it as a private club or as developable land or as a historical property or as a brand associated with a former president who may yet become president again. But value is not the same as worth, and price is not the same as meaning. The true value of Mar-a-Lago, if we are honest with ourselves, lies not in its marble floors or its hand-painted ceilings or its ocean views or its celebrity guest list, but in its capacity to serve as a mirror, to reflect back to us the uncomfortable truths about American wealth and power that we would prefer not to see, that our luxury depends on the exploitation of others, that our security is an illusion purchased at the expense of the vulnerable, that our myths of meritocracy and equal opportunity disguise systems designed to concentrate wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands, that our political institutions have been captured by private interests, that our collective future is being sacrificed for the short-term profits of a tiny elite, and that we have constructed a society where a mansion can house classified documents in a bathroom while homeless veterans sleep on the streets, where membership in a private club can cost $500,000 while millions of Americans cannot afford healthcare, where the wealthy can purchase proximity to power while ordinary citizens struggle to be heard. These are not comfortable truths, and they do not fit easily into the stories we like to tell about America as a land of opportunity where hard work is rewarded and where anyone can make it, but discomfort does not make them less true, and our unwillingness to look at them does not make them go away. Mar-a-Lago, in all its glittering, troubling, contradictory complexity, demands that we look, that we see, that we acknowledge what we have built and what it has cost, not just in dollars but in lives, in labor, in dignity, in the integrity of our institutions and the health of our democracy. It demands that we ask whether this is the society we want, whether this is the legacy we want to leave, whether we are willing to continue down a path where wealth concentrates ever more dramatically, where power operates ever more brazenly without accountability, where the gap between rhetoric and reality grows ever wider, where the machinery of government serves private interests rather than the public good, where monuments to excess rise along coastlines that may soon be underwater, built on foundations that are already crumbling, testaments to a civilization that chose opulence over sustainability, spectacle over substance, the performance of greatness over its reality. The dark truth behind Mar-a-Lago is not hidden in classified documents or security breaches or tax records or labor violations or environmental degradation, though all of those things are part of it. The dark truth is that Mar-a-Lago is us, a mirror of American society in the 21st century, and we cannot turn away from what we see reflected there without lying to ourselves about who we have become and what we are willing to tolerate in the pursuit of wealth, power, and the desperate, exhausting, ultimately futile attempt to build monuments that will outlast our mortality and announce to the world that we mattered, that we belonged, that we were here, even as the water rises, as the foundations crack, as the invisible hands that hold everything together finally let go, as the fantasy crumbles and reality, patient and inexorable, reclaims what was always hers.